Okay, question 11. This one I know confuses people. It is very specific to math language, as we've been talking about. So the good news is if you understand the language, it's straightforward. The bad news is the language is not always easy to get the first time. So this is why we practice. Now, what we have here in question 11, it says the distance that Juan runs is a function of the time spent running. Now, whenever I have a word problem, specifically a word problem in functions, I want to look and make sure I know what the variables are. In our functions, we only have two variables. So if I read this again, the distance that Juan runs is a function of the time spent running. The question is, what are the two variables? Now, there are a lot of words here, but Juan, in this case, is not a variable. He's a person. But if I read, I have the distance. So the distance that Juan runs is one variable. And then it says, as a function of the time spent running. So my two variables here are distance and time. The distance run and the time spent running. And so now it's just a question of which one is the independent variable and which one is the dependent variable. Now, one of the things you could go back and look at your notes is another word for the independent variable is the input, and another word for the dependent variable is the output. And there's a sentence frame in your notes that we discussed where we basically say that the dependent variable is a function of the independent variable. Running out of space. Independent variable. So if I find a sentence that says something is a function of something, which, by the way, this one says is a function of, then I know the first variable is the dependent variable, which is distance. And the second variable is the independent variable, which in this case is time. Now, one of the other things we learned was that instead of using the confusing is a function of, we can replace that with depends on. So in this case, the distance depends on the time spent running. So Juan will only go as far as the time he is allowed to run. And so the dependent variable depends on the independent variable. So that's just another way to think about it. But in general, if you know this sentence frame, you know the first one will always be the dependent and the second one will always be the independent.